was August of 2018, and I was driving alone on Route 93 in Arizona, returning from a work trip in Las Vegas. The route was famous for being isolated, cutting through miles of desert and canyons. I'd left the city late, and now I was on the road, with little traffic and a sky lit only by the stars. The radio played soft music, and the steady hum of the engine filled the emptiness around me. After about 2 hours of driving, I saw something on the side of the road. A car stopped with its hazard lights on. I slowed down, instinctively curious. As I got closer, I saw it was a blue sedan, apparently undamaged, but there was no one nearby. The driver's door was slightly ajar, and the interior light faintly illuminated the empty inside. Something felt off. Even though the temperature was mild, a chill ran down my spine. I thought about stopping to help, but decided to keep going. People in desperate situations don't usually abandon their cars in the middle of nowhere. I called the local police and reported the vehicle, but they said they had already received another call about it hours earlier. The operator's voice sounded apathetic, as if this wasn't an unusual occurrence. I kept driving, but the feeling of unease lingered. The road was winding in places, cutting through small elevations and blind curves. My headlights illuminated the dark asphalt, and the solitude was almost overwhelming. That's when I saw something else by the side of the road. A person. It was a man, dressed in jeans and a brown jacket, walking slowly along the shoulder. He carried a worn backpack and seemed to be limping slightly. I slowed down as I passed him, and he raised his arm in a gesture that looked like he was asking for a ride. By reflex, I tightened my grip on the steering wheel and kept driving. I glanced in the rearview mirror, and he was standing still, staring at me as I drove away. Something about the way he stood motionless, like a statue, made me uneasy. I tried to ignore it and focus on the road, but my heart was beating faster. It wasn't uncommon to see travelers hitchhiking, but on that road, at that hour, it didn't feel right. 10 minutes later, around another bend, I saw flashing lights in the distance. Another car was stopped, this time with the passenger door open. As I passed it, something made my stomach turn. It looked like the same blue sedan I had seen earlier, but in a different spot. I slowed down but didn't stop. Something didn't add up. I knew I had to be miles away from where I had seen the first car. I called the police again, trying to report what was happening, but this time the call dropped before I could finish my sentence. There was no signal. My hands started sweating on the steering wheel. The discomfort that had been just a feeling was now an overwhelming presence. I turned on the radio to distract myself, but there was only static. The road seemed narrower, as if the desert around me was closing in. Then as I turned another corner, I saw something that made me slam on the brakes. The man with the backpack was there again, walking along the side of the road. But I was certain I had already passed him. He raised his arm again, the same slow and deliberate gesture, as if he knew I would see him. My mind tried to find explanations. Maybe he had taken a shortcut. Maybe there were two men who looked alike. But deep down, I knew the truth. It was him. The same jacket, the same backpack, the same limp. I sped up, trying to leave it all behind, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I looked in the rearview mirror again, and this time, he was gone. He had disappeared. The relief was immediate but short-lived. Around another bend, I saw the lights of a car coming from the opposite direction. It was the first time in hours that I had seen another vehicle, and I felt strangely comforted. I turned on my high beams to signal my presence, but as we got closer, I noticed something disturbing. It was the same blue sedan. The car passed me slowly, and I could see a figure sitting in the driver's seat, but I couldn't make out their face. When I looked in the side mirror, it was already gone. There were no lights behind me anymore, as if the car had never been there. My chest felt heavy, and my breathing quickened. Every bend seemed to bring something new, something worse. When I finally saw a gas station in the distance, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. The lights were like a beacon of hope in the oppressive darkness. I parked quickly and went inside the station, which seemed deserted except for an elderly attendant sitting behind the counter. He barely looked up when I walked in, but I noticed he was watching me from the corner of his eye. I bought a coffee and tried to act normal. "This road's been strange tonight," I said, trying to ease the tension. The man looked at me, his expression turning serious. "You saw him, didn't you?" he asked, as if he already knew exactly what I was talking about. Before I could answer, he continued. "People say it's just a story, but I've heard it from too many drivers. The man with the backpack, the blue car, they show up when you're alone on the road, and they don't leave until you finally stop to pick one of them up." I swallowed hard. He seemed serious, but my mind was still trying to rationalize what had happened. I finished my coffee quickly, thanked him, and returned to my car. But something inside me knew that night wasn't over. Since then, I've never driven alone on that road again. Sometimes I hear other drivers' reports of similar encounters. And every time I think about those hours, one question haunts me. What would have happened if I had stopped? It was September of 2019, a humid night in the middle of Kansas. I was in my second year working as a truck driver, traveling across the country, delivering goods. That night, I had driven nearly 900 kilometers, and the exhaustion was starting to take its toll. I decided to stop at a truck park to rest before hitting the road again at dawn. The park was in a remote area, surrounded by open fields and a few flickering fluorescent lights in the distance. It wasn't the kind of place where you felt safe, but truckers like me were used to stopping wherever we could. I parked in one of the last available spaces, next to an old truck with peeling paint. As I got out, I noticed the place felt emptier than it should. Only 2 or 3 trucks had visible drivers. The rest seemed abandoned or parked for a long time. I grabbed my snack and climbed back into the cab. The plan was to eat something quickly and sleep, but something about the atmosphere unsettled me. As I chewed on my sandwich, I saw a man walking between the trucks. He wasn't a trucker, that much was obvious. He was wearing a heavy coat, which seemed strange given the heat that night, and carrying a small duffel bag. He walked right past my truck without looking in, but his presence made me uncomfortable. Most truckers avoided any kind of interaction with strangers in places like that, especially at night. I decided to lock the doors and turn off the cab lights. About an hour later, as I was lying down, I heard footsteps outside. They were light, almost imperceptible, but enough to catch my attention. I peeked through the side window curtain and saw the same man standing next to the truck beside mine. He had his back to me, as if he was trying to open the other cab's door. My heart started racing. It was clear he had no reason to be there. I grabbed my phone and dialed the local police, but the signal was weak. The call dropped before it could connect. I stayed still for a few seconds, listening to his footsteps moving away, but the sense of danger didn't fade. I decided to stay awake and keep watch. I slightly pulled back the curtain to get a better view of the park, and that's when I noticed something else strange. The old truck next to mine now had its door open, but there were no lights on inside. The man was in there. For some reason, my mind jumped to the worst-case scenario. Maybe he was just a thief, but what if he wasn't? What if something more sinister was going on? The stories I had heard over the years started playing in my head. Truckers disappearing at remote stops, bodies found months later in abandoned trucks. I decided it wasn't worth the risk. I started my truck ready to leave, but before I could shift into gear, something happened that made me freeze. The door of the old truck slammed shut, and the man came running straight toward my vehicle. He stopped a few meters from my truck, his face illuminated by the headlights. For the first time, I saw his face clearly. He looked ordinary, but his eyes were wide open, almost crazed. His expression was one of panic, not aggression. He started shouting, but the sound was muffled by the engine. I turned off the headlights and kept watching, trying to figure out what was happening. That's when I noticed the detail that made my blood run cold. There was someone else. Another person emerged from the old truck. A hunched figure, wearing something that looked like a dark raincoat. The faint light from a nearby lamp briefly illuminated a shiny object in their hand. A knife. The man who had run to my truck looked back, terrified, and started banging on my door, desperate. "Please let me in," he shouted, but I didn't know what to do. My instinct told me to help him, but my reason screamed at me to get out of there. As I hesitated, the figure with the knife moved closer, slowly, as if savoring the moment. Something about the way they walked, calm, methodical, left me completely paralyzed. This wasn't someone acting on impulse. They knew exactly what they were doing. The man outside started banging harder on my window, pleading. But when the hooded figure got close enough, he stopped. He looked at me with wide eyes and whispered, "Go." Before I could react, he ran into the darkness, disappearing among the trucks. The hooded figure turned their head toward me, but did nothing. They just stood there watching me. I didn't wait to find out what would happen next. I slammed my foot on the accelerator and sped away as fast as I could. My eyes stayed fixed on the road, but my mind kept replaying that man's face and the words he said before disappearing. I drove for nearly an hour before stopping at another gas station, this time in a busier area. I called the police and tried to explain what had happened, but they didn't seem to take it seriously. Probably just a misunderstanding between two travelers, they said. But something told me it wasn't that simple. I spent the following days trying to forget, but the memory of that hooded figure and the knife kept haunting me. And what bothered me the most was what happened in the old truck. The man who begged me to leave knew something I never want to find out. Since that night, I've never stopped at an isolated truck park again. And every time I pass one, I can't help but glance between the vehicles, hoping never to see that man again. It was June of 2014, and I was driving back home to rural Oregon after a family reunion in Portland. It was the kind of drive I had done dozens of times, crossing stretches of deserted roads surrounded by dense forests and small villages that seemed abandoned. I always preferred driving at night because the roads were less busy, but on this trip, something felt different. The sun had set hours ago, and the silence of the road was almost suffocating. The radio was off, and I was driving with the windows closed, trying to keep out the cold air coming from the mountains. The clock read 11:45 at night when I realized my gas tank was nearly empty. The next town was about 30 miles away, and I knew I needed to find fuel soon. That's when I saw a small sign on the side of the road. It pointed to an exit for a service station, 2 miles. I sighed with relief and followed the secondary road, which was narrower and more winding. The trees formed a natural tunnel, and my headlights barely managed to illuminate the path ahead. After a few minutes, the road opened into a clearing, and there it was. An old wooden house with a small illuminated sign hanging from the porch. It read, "Service Station and Convenience." There was a rusty gas pump next to the entrance and a small empty parking lot. The place looked like it belonged to another time, as if it should have been abandoned. I parked and got out of the car, feeling the cold, damp air hit my face. Despite the absolute silence, something about the environment felt wrong. The kind of feeling you can't explain, but feel deep in your bones. Even so, I walked over to the pump and started filling up. The sound of gas flowing was the only thing breaking the silence. As I waited, I looked at the house. The lights were on, but there was no one in sight. The glass on the door was foggy, and I could see vague shadows moving inside. I thought about going in to pay, but something held me back. I decided to wait outside, watching. That's when I heard a sound behind me. Slow, heavy footsteps coming from the parking lot. My heart raced, and I turned around immediately, but there was no one there. Just my car and the emptiness around it. I tried convincing myself it was all in my head, but the unease kept growing. I got back into the car, ready to leave as quickly as possible. But when I went to put the pump back on the holder, I noticed something had changed. There was a footprint on the ground near the pump. A large footprint, as if someone had been standing there just seconds ago. I got into the car and started the engine, but before I could drive away, I saw something in the rearview mirror. A figure was standing on the house's porch watching me. It was hard to make out the details, but it seemed to be a man wearing a wide-brimmed hat that covered part of his face. He didn't move. He just stared at me. I shifted into gear and started driving off, but something inside me forced me to glance back at the house. Now there were more figures. Two, then three, all emerging from the shadows and stopping on the porch. None of them seemed normal. Their movements were stiff, almost mechanical, as if they were rehearsing each step. My heart was pounding in my chest as I sped down the narrow road, trying to get away from that place as fast as possible. But with each turn, something seemed to pull me back. The road, which had felt straight before, now seemed more winding, more confusing. After driving for about 15 minutes, I saw lights ahead. But instead of a town or a gas station, it was the same house. The same porch, the same figures standing there as if they had never left. I blinked my headlights, trying to confirm if it was real, but the figures didn't move. They just stayed there watching me. Without thinking twice, I accelerated, passing the house and trying to ignore the growing panic inside me. For another 30 minutes, I kept driving non-stop. The road seemed endless, as if I were trapped in a loop with no way out. My fuel was running low, and the thought of stopping terrified me. That's when I saw something on the shoulder of the road. It was a car. My car, parked in the same spot where I had been before, next to the gas pump. My body froze, and my mind started spinning. How was this possible? I couldn't be seeing the same car. But there it was, with the doors locked and the headlights off. I pulled over and got out of the car, my body trembling with fear. I walked slowly toward the parked vehicle, trying to make sense of what was happening. I touched the hood. It was cold. I looked inside and my heart nearly stopped. There was someone in the driver's seat, someone who looked like me. My own image reflected in the glass, but it was different. The face was empty, like a mask, and the eyes were dark, almost as if there was nothing there. Before I could react, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around quickly and saw the figures from the porch, now standing just a few feet away. They weren't walking. They were just there, closer, as if the space between us had disappeared. I ran back to my car, started the engine, and sped off without looking back. My mind was in shambles, trying to understand what was happening. When I finally saw the lights of a town in the distance, the relief was so overwhelming that tears started streaming down my face. I reached a hotel and locked myself in the room, trying to forget what had happened. But that night, before I fell asleep, I looked out the window, and for a brief moment, I was certain I saw a light on the horizon. A light coming from that house.